The screams echoed down the concrete hallway long after the guards unlocked the cell. What they found inside wasn't just a crime scene, it was a waking nightmare. One man mutilated. The other? Smiling, with blood on his lips. He told them the devil made him do it. Then he asked for seconds. Anthony Rivas arrived at the county detention center in the middle of the night, transported in silence under the watchful eyes of two deputies who refused to speak during the entire drive. They said later that something about him made their skin crawl. He didn't resist. He didn't talk. He barely blinked. He just sat in the back seat, hands cuffed tight in front of him, humming softly under his breath. The tune had no melody, just a low, repetitive drone, like a warning that no one could understand. His intake paperwork listed him as 32 years old, 5 feet 11 inches, no known history of mental illness, but recently arrested on suspicion of assaulting a stranger in a parking garage. The victim described the attack as animalistic, and claimed Rivas spoke in a voice that wasn't human. The police chalked it up to meth psychosis. The psych eval at the city holding center was inconclusive, and he was shipped off to county to await further assessment. When Rivas entered the facility, officers noticed the scratches on his arms, deep gouges like claw marks, self-inflicted. He had scrawled strange symbols into his skin, symbols that didn't match any gang tags or known tattoos. When asked about them, he simply whispered, "They told me to mark myself so they could see me in the dark." That line stuck with Officer Delaney, who'd been doing this job for over a decade and thought he'd heard it all. But Rivas was different. Not violent. Not loud. Just wrong. His first night inside he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bunk with his eyes locked on the air vent above him, as if waiting for something to crawl through. His cellmate, Jerome Tucker, a minor drug offender due to be released in under 6 months, asked for a new cell the next morning. He claimed Rivas stared at him all night without blinking and mumbled some kind of prayer backwards, literally backwards. The request was denied. Cells were overcrowded, and Jerome was considered stable and nonviolent. They figured he was just being dramatic. By the third night, strange reports started coming in. Guards on late watch said the lights above cell 313, Rivas's cell, flickered every night around 3:17 a.m. sharp. Maintenance checked the wiring. Nothing wrong. The camera inside the cell cut out for 12 seconds that same night. When it came back, Rivas had somehow carved a near-perfect circle into the cement floor using only the end of a plastic toothbrush. Inside the circle were more symbols. Unfamiliar, jagged, unnerving. Jerome became increasingly distressed. During lunch in the mess hall, he told another inmate that he'd woken up to find Rivas standing over him, hand hovering just inches from his face, whispering something in what he called the language of broken things. He'd filed a second request for transfer. Again denied. There were no open beds. The prison psychiatrist was called in to observe. She watched Rivas through the reinforced glass during one of his episodes. He sat perfectly still for almost 30 minutes. Then, with no warning, he slammed his head against the wall, hard enough to split the skin. He didn't cry out. Didn't flinch. Just stared at the blood running down the concrete and whispered, "I have to open the door." When she questioned him later, Rivas insisted he was referring to a spiritual doorway, not a physical one. "Something is coming," he said calmly. "I'm just the key." Staff still considered it a mental breakdown, possibly schizophrenia. He was placed under observation but not isolation. The facility's resources were stretched too thin. More pressing cases, more dangerous inmates, and more predictable behavior took priority. And Rivas, for all his strangeness, wasn't violent. Not yet. A week before the incident, another guard, a rookie, reported hearing what sounded like two people arguing in the cell. He said it didn't sound like Rivas and Jerome. He was sure there was a third voice, low, guttural, almost animal-like. When they checked the cell, Rivas was sitting calmly on his bunk and Jerome was curled up in the corner, shaking. He refused to speak. The next day he refused to eat. Later, investigators would note that Jerome had begun scribbling symbols in the margins of the Bible he kept in his locker. Identical symbols to the ones Rivas had etched into his arms. No one intervened. There were signs. Plenty of them. But the truth is, no one wanted to believe something supernatural could be happening in a concrete cell block in the middle of upstate New York. They'd seen mental breaks. They'd dealt with violence. They'd seen inmates light fires, attack guards, even try to swallow razor blades, but this was something else. And whether it was mass suggestion, a psychological breakdown, or something far darker, the truth is this. Anthony Rivas brought something into that jail that didn't arrive with the prison van. Something unseen. Something hungry. And by the time the system noticed, it was already too late. It was a Thursday night, just after 2 a.m., when the first scream rang out. Not the usual yelling, not some fight over food or a loud nightmare. This scream was different, primal, raw, like something being torn out of a man's soul. It echoed off the concrete walls of cell block D, sending shivers through the skeleton crew working the overnight shift. Officer Ramirez was the first to respond. He had been watching the monitors when the camera feed for cell 313 suddenly went dark. Static. A familiar glitch, they thought. That camera had gone out before. He clicked to another view, and that's when he heard the scream again. He radioed for backup as he grabbed his keys, already sprinting down the corridor. Officer Green met him halfway, eyes wide, holding a flashlight even though the overheads were still on. "You hear that?" Green asked, his voice cracking slightly. "It's coming from Rivas's cell." Ramirez didn't respond. He didn't have to. They both knew who was in 313. And they both felt it. Something was wrong. Very wrong. As they approached the cell, the sounds changed. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic noise. A wet, slurping sound. The kind of noise that sticks to the inside of your ears. They hesitated only a second before unlocking the door. What they saw inside changed everything. Jerome Tucker was lying on the floor in a position no body should ever be in. Limbs twisted, one eye wide open in a frozen expression of terror, mouth agape. His torso was ripped open, ribcage cracked like a smashed cage. Blood coated the floor, smeared along the walls, pooling around the mattress. And in the middle of it all, on his knees, was Anthony Rivas, shirtless, soaked in crimson, calmly chewing something with slow, deliberate bites. When the door opened, Rivas looked up and smiled. That smile would haunt Officer Ramirez for years. It wasn't the grin of a man caught doing something horrific. It was the smile of satisfaction, of peace. Like he'd finally done what he was supposed to do. Blood was smeared across his chin, dripping from his fingers, and something pink and soft rested beside him on the floor, a piece of flesh. Officer Green backed out of the room and vomited in the hallway. Ramirez, pale and trembling, drew his baton but didn't step forward. "Get on the ground," he shouted, his voice breaking. Rivas tilted his head as if confused. Then he said it. Clear, calm, like a child reciting something from memory. "It wasn't me. He let me in." They dragged him out of the cell, cuffed him with trembling hands and called in medical and lockdown protocols. Rivas didn't resist. He kept repeating the same sentence under his breath. "He let me in. He let me in. He let me in." What happened next was chaos. Cell Block D was sealed off. Every officer on duty was pulled for debrief. The coroner arrived at dawn, and even he had to step outside twice before completing his report. Jerome's body had been mutilated in a way that suggested not just rage but ritual. Skin flayed in precise patterns, internal organs partially removed, not all of them accounted for. The forensic team found something else. Carved into the underside of the metal bunk, where only someone lying on the floor could see, were dozens of symbols, identical to those Rivas had scratched into his arms the night he arrived. And in the center, written in blood, was a single word, host. Later, during his first official interrogation, Rivas refused to answer questions about the killing. Instead, he stared at the two-way mirror and began speaking in what sounded like Latin, not the classical kind, but a corrupted, darker dialect that even a court translator couldn't fully identify. He eventually stopped speaking altogether and just smiled. When asked directly if he had killed his cellmate, he finally responded, "I did not." But he did. He would not clarify who he was. The jail psychologist was called back in, this time under direct orders to assess whether Rivas was fit to stand trial. During the evaluation, Rivas sat motionless for over an hour, until the power flickered, just once. When it came back, he looked her in the eyes and whispered, "He's inside the wall now." The psychiatrist refused to continue the session and requested a transfer to another facility. She left the state 3 weeks later. A priest from a nearby diocese was brought in next, at the urging of one of the responding officers, who swore the symbols carved into the bunk resembled something from a forbidden grim war he'd seen once in a theology course. The priest spent 15 minutes in the cell with Rivas. When he emerged, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. Pale, shaking, silent. He refused to speak to the press, the warden, or anyone else. Just crossed himself, said don't let him speak again, and walked away. No one spoke Jerome Tucker's name again. His family was told he died in custody. The official report cited a psychotic episode resulting in fatal violence. But everyone who had been there that night, everyone who heard the screams, saw the carnage, or looked into Anthony Rivas's empty eyes, knew the truth was darker. And it wasn't over. In the days that followed the incident, the jail turned cold. Not physically, though some guards claimed the temperature dropped in cell block D, but in presence. Like something had passed through the place and left a chill behind. Conversations were quieter. Guards made excuses to switch shifts. Even the inmates kept their heads down. Something had shifted and everyone felt it. Anthony Rivas, the man at the center of the storm, sat quietly in an isolation cell, heavily restrained and under 24-hour surveillance. There were no more outbursts, no screams, no chanting. Just silence and that disturbing empty stare. When a nurse came to check his vitals, she found him smiling at the wall. When she asked what he was looking at, he simply said, "He's still in here. He just likes to hide now." She never came back. The media caught on fast. A leaked report described cannibalistic behavior and possible satanic markings. News outlets jumped at the story. Possessed inmate slaughters cellmate. Killer claims demonic influence. Evil in cell block D. The public wanted an explanation, something to label and dismiss. But every interview, every evaluation only deepened the mystery. The psychological team brought in a specialist from out of state, a forensic psychiatrist with experience in violent delusions and rare dissociative disorders. After 3 sessions with Rivas, he submitted a sealed report and refused to testify in court. Off the record, he told the warden that what he encountered did not align with any known psychiatric condition. He said Rivas sometimes spoke in what he called a composite language, parts of Aramaic, Latin, and something else entirely. More troubling was that during their final session, Rivas described details from the psychiatrist's personal life, specific, private memories. Ones he had never shared with anyone. He knew things he couldn't have known, the doctor said. Things I've never even said out loud. When Rivas was brought into the courtroom for his arraignment, he was heavily sedated and shackled. His eyes stayed half closed, head slightly tilted. But the moment the judge asked for a plea, Rivas lifted his head and spoke clearly. "Not guilty. I was only the vessel." The courtroom went silent. For a split second his voice sounded layered, as if someone else had spoken at the same time. From that point forward, the case fractured. The public debated whether Rivas was mentally ill or something more. Talk shows brought on demonologists and criminal psychologists. Internet forums buzzed with theories. Was this a rare case of possession, or was the man simply a highly disturbed manipulator? Some argued that the signs were all textbook. Hallucinations, disorganized speech, delusions of persecution. Others pointed to the symbols, the eerie timing of electrical failures, the priest who left town, and the bizarre effect Rivas had on everyone around him. Meanwhile, inside the jail, things continued to unravel. The isolation wing housing Rivas began experiencing strange malfunctions. Lights would flicker, sometimes shutting off entirely. Guards reported hearing whispers through the intercom when no one was transmitting. One officer claimed he saw movement in Rivas's cell even when Rivas was sedated. Shadows shifting against the walls, crawling upward. Then came the final straw. During a routine check, a guard monitoring the live video feed saw Rivas standing perfectly still in his cell, staring directly into the camera. The feed glitched. When it returned, Rivas hadn't moved, but something had changed. Blood had appeared on the lens. When officers rushed to the cell, they found no blood inside. Rivas was asleep on the floor. But when the footage was reviewed, the glitch repeated, the same exact moment, same expression, same red smear. The video technician called it a digital residue. No one knew what that meant. The prison transferred Rivas to a high-security psychiatric hospital in another state, under extreme surveillance. He hasn't spoken since. Not to guards. Not to doctors. Not to the occasional priest who still tries to reach him. But according to one staff report, a nurse swears she saw him drawing symbols on the wall with his finger, though there was no ink, no pencil, no blood. Just movement like tracing invisible things. There's a growing belief among staff that Rivas never snapped. That he didn't lose his mind, he gave it up. Willingly. Whatever spoke through him that night, whatever watched from behind those dead eyes, is still there. Waiting. Watching. Quiet. The official records list the incident as an act of extreme psychosis resulting in homicide and mutilation. The case is closed. Jerome Tucker's family received a settlement. No trial was ever held. The psychiatric board declared Rivas permanently unfit for proceedings. But behind closed doors in the hallways of the facility where he now resides, staff have another name for him. They don't call him Rivas. They don't even say his name. They call him the host. And sometimes when the night is quiet enough, The nurses on the graveyard shift swear they can hear breathing from his padded cell, even when he isn't inside.